As the 18th century came to a close, many of the rice planters of the Georgetown region were becoming millionaires, living comfortable, cultured lives. President George Washington visited the area in 1791, noting that he was introduced to upwards of 50 ladies who assembled a tea party on the occasion. Of the 4 plantations that comprise Brookgreen Gardens today, each has a unique history. At Laurel Hill, on the northern border of Brookgreen Gardens, a brick chimney looms, a remnant of the mill that once produced great quantities of rice here. Brookgreen Plantation was the birthplace of painter Washington Allston, whose father owned both Brookgreen and Springfield. Washington Allston inherited Springfield Plantation and sold the land to pay for his art education in England. Today, Washington Allston is considered America's first great romantic painter. His dark, mystical style may show the influence of stories told to him by enslaved Africans when he was a boy. At the heart of the Oaks Plantation is a tragic mystery. Born in 1779, Joseph Allston inherited the Oaks from his grandfather when he was only 5. At 21, Joseph traveled to New York, where he was introduced to Northern high society. The prosperous Southern aristocrat caught the attention of Revolutionary War hero Aaron Burr and his daughter Theodosia. Joseph Allston and Theodosia Burr were married the following year.
Some people say they actually fell in love and that it was a great romantic story. Other people say that Aaron Burr was politically ambitious and he wanted to be president, and having the support of a wealthy rice planting family from South Carolina would be beneficial to him. Whatever, they married in 1801.
Life at the Oaks was hard for Theodosia. She was accustomed to the city and felt isolated on the plantation. She and Joseph had one child, Aaron Burr Allston. When he was 10, young Aaron died of malaria. Theodosia was devastated by the death of her son and decided to go to New York to visit her father. The year was 1813. The country was at war, and Joseph Allston, who by now was governor of South Carolina, couldn't leave the state. He said goodbye to his wife on the landing at the Oaks. Theodosia took a small boat to Georgetown, where she boarded the Patriot, a ship bound for New York. Theodosia Burr Allston was never seen or heard from again.
A storm came down the coast that winter in January, and tracking its passage down and the speed of the ship, somewhere off the Outer Banks, it's believed that the storm and the ship met. There are all kinds of tales about what may have happened, pirates and things like that, but if you look at history, it was the War of 1812. The British fleet was off the east coast of the United States, and so we know that there weren't many pirates out there.
Joseph Allston died in 1816 at the age of 37, still mourning Theodosia. He was laid to rest alongside his son in the Allston family cemetery at the Oaks Plantation. No antebellum homes exist at Brookgreen Gardens today, but this grand house at Hopsawee Plantation, a few miles south of Georgetown, is a reminder of the elegant lifestyle enjoyed by the rice planters of the Waccamaw. For more than 40 years after Joseph Allston died, they continued to make huge fortunes, some selling over 1 million pounds of rice a year. They were a small percentage of the white population, but they owned more than 50% of the land in the district. In 1860, they avidly supported secession from the Union. The Civil War changed everything for the rice planters. In 1862, Union gunboats sailed up the Waccamaw from Georgetown, raided the rice plantations, and freed the slaves. Planter families fled, abandoning their homes and farms. Rice growing had depended upon slave labor. After emancipation, many former slaves left the plantations. By 1910, no one was growing rice commercially in Georgetown County. With the passing of time, the outlines of the fields have softened, and trees have sprouted on the dikes. Today, the banks of these canals, created at a terrible human price, seem like part of the natural landscape. By the 1920s, the former rice plantations of the Waccamaw Neck were selling at bargain prices. A group of sportsmen bought Springfield, Laurel Hill, Brookgreen, and the Oaks as a hunting preserve, and combined them to form the Brookgreen Gun Club. Author Julia Peterkin, daughter of one of the club's sponsors, portrayed the area and its Gullah people in her novels. In 1929, she won the Pulitzer Prize for Literature. Brookgreen's next transformation had its beginnings in the 1920s, when Anna Hyatt met Archer Huntington. Born in 1876, Anna von Hyatt came from a family that supported her interest in animals and the arts. Her mother and sister were both artists. Her father was a professor of paleontology.
And she developed that scientist's power of observation. And it didn't hurt that she also had a photographic memory, and she was able to rely on that because artists, of course, often use models posing, and animals don't pose.
In 1902, Anna went to New York City to pursue her work, but she had very little formal training as a sculptor.
In New York, a short time at the Art Students League, and that was probably not much more than about a month. So when I say self-taught, she really is self-taught.
In Paris in 1906, Anna became interested in Joan of Arc. She created a sculpture showing the saint ready for her first battle and won a prize at the Paris Salon. A few years later, she was commissioned to create a Joan of Arc for Riverside Park in New York City. It was the city's first public sculpture of a woman by a woman, and the first to depict St. Joan in proper period costume. By the time Anna Hyatt met Archer Huntington in 1921, they were both well known in the world of traditional figurative art, and Archer was a very wealthy man. The transcontinental railroads were the source of Archer Huntington's riches. His adoptive father, Collis P. Huntington, was one of the builders of the railroads. He left a third of his estate, worth more than $1 billion today, to Archer. Archer's mother, Arabella Huntington, loved the arts and introduced her son to European art museums at an early age. She was one of the most important art collectors of her generation, amassing a significant collection of paintings, jewelry, and antiques. Like his mother, Archer chose to devote his time and money to art, philanthropy, and museums. It has been said of him that every place he put his foot down, a museum sprang up. Archer Huntington was also a leading Hispanic scholar. In 1904, he founded the Hispanic Society of America, and this is what eventually led him to Anna Hyatt.
He commissioned her to create a medal for the Hispanic Society of America, which was the first museum that Archer Huntington founded. And then in the following year, the two of them served on a committee together for the National Sculpture Society. And that's when they really got to know one another as human beings. And that was in 1922. And in the following year, they were married. And it was quite a surprise for many people. That people didn't realize that this romance had begun. Of course, she was 47 and he was 53 when they were married. It was the first marriage for her and the second for him. But in many ways, it was the union of kindred spirits. made her name and her career entirely on her own. She didn't rely on Archer Huntington's wealth in order to establish her art. She, in 1915, was listed as one of 10 women earning $50,000 a year. So she was well established. And in fact, if anything, his wealth allowed her the luxury of not having to sell her work. So from that point forward, she was able to donate her sculpture.
The Huntingtons discovered Brookgreen in 1929 while they were looking for a place to build a winter home. Anna had developed tuberculosis, and they wanted to get away from the cold northern winters. Initially, they purchased about 6,600 acres of land at Brookgreen for $225,000. Throughout the 30s, they continued to buy land until they owned 9,127 acres of forest, beach, and riverfront property. The Huntingtons' vision for Brookgreen Gardens, a place to exhibit American figurative sculpture outdoors amidst native plants and animals, quickly began to materialize. Anna designed the garden in the shape of a butterfly, opening it to the public in 1932 with her sculptures forming the core of the collection. One of the first to find a place in the garden was Anna's Diana of the Chase, which had resided in the Huntingtons' New York townhouse. Soon they began to include the work of other American artists.
There was sort of an unwritten project that went along with the Brookgreen collection because, of course, this is 1930 and the Depression was well underway, and by the time Brookgreen Gardens had been founded in July of 1931, there were lots of starving artists out there. So the Huntingtons really were helping in some ways to support artists who had no other patrons. They had lost their patrons with the stock market crash.
At the same time, the Huntingtons were building a home for themselves on the oceanfront side of the Brookgreen property. Made entirely of brick, it had 30 rooms facing 2 open courtyards in the style of a Moorish fort or Atalaya, and Atalaya became its name. Many of its walls featured slump-joint mortar, a style the Masons called the Huntington Squeeze. Archer and Anna Huntington had no children, but they loved dogs and raised Scottish deerhounds. A French bull terrier named Geisha was another favorite. The Huntingtons' concern for animals extended to wild creatures as well, and the Native Wildlife Park was an essential part of the plan for Brookgreen. It included animals such as possums, skunks, fox squirrels, and for a while black bears. When the animals were moved to their present location in the 1970s, bears were deemed too large for the small zoo. The construction of Brookgreen and Atalaya provided desperately needed jobs for the people of the Waccamaw Neck. Healthcare and education were also sorely lacking, especially for the black residents of the area. So the Huntingtons built a clinic and a school for African American children on the Brookgreen property. The couple made a lasting impression on the locals. June Hora and her sister Genevieve Peterkin were young girls when they met the Huntingtons. Their mother, Genevieve Wilcox Chandler, a folklorist for the Writers Project of the WPA and an artist herself, was Brookgreen's first hostess.
She was at the post office one morning, and Robbie Oliver, a man she had taught in school when he was a boy, he spoke to her and he said, "Miss Genevieve, I'm leaving Brookgreen." Mr. Huntington had hired him to take care of the little museum of small sculpture where Mama worked later.
He felt very confined at Brookgreen and didn't like being in an office and sitting there talking to people all day long. But that was my mother's cup of tea.
And Mama said, "Robert, do you mind if I go and apply for your job?" And he said, "Oh, Miss Genevieve, Mr. Huntington wouldn't hire a woman." But then, of course, Mama had studied art in New York and England. And so I think Mr. Huntington was thrilled to have somebody come along with a background in art to put in that job in Brookgreen. And so he hired her that day.
She met so many fascinating people. Back in the early days, you could go into Brookgreen in a yacht from the river. And Clark Gable came in one time on his yacht, and Burr came in. So that was exciting. I was glad she had heard about him because we were so backward in those days. We hardly ever got to a movie. Each year they had the people at Brookgreen over for tea, and we went over to pick my mother up. And anyway, I remember walking in the room, and he just dominated the room. I couldn't tell you what was in the room. He was so fascinating, he really was, and you had to look up to see him.
I know he wore a size 14 shoe because when Mr. Huntington died, Ms. Huntington had the clothes that he had at Atalaya. Well, she had Mama to distribute them to some people around here, and it was, I think my little brother's kept in his undershirts for years as little sleeping garments, but they passed on his clothes to people around here, and there was no one that could wear his shoes. But then we had a man here who said he could wear anything from a 6 to a 10, so I think he took them and made use of them.
This very much was a project for the people of this area, to give people jobs and to have a livelihood where there really had not been such an opportunity for many, many years. It wasn't just the Depression that depressed this area. The Waccamaw Neck really had been almost like it was still in the 19th century. Time had not moved forward much at all. The only way to get here when the Huntingtons bought the property was by boat. There were no bridges, no electricity, and a telephone was a luxury that most people didn't have for many, many years. So we can thank Archer Huntington for a lot of things here in this area, because he did personally bring electricity here, paying for a line to be run from Georgetown. So it really wasn't until the Huntingtons came here that people living in Pawleys Island or Murrells Inlet could have electricity.
The Huntingtons continued to add to the sculpture collection at Brookgreen Gardens with work by many of the great figurative artists of the time, including Paul Manship, Paul Genuine, and Frederick Remington. Anna carried on with her own work, modeling in clay and casting many of her sculptures in aluminum.
Initially, she cast her work in bronze, but in 1932, she began to use aluminum as a casting material, and she was the first sculptor in America to do so. She liked it because it was lightweight. It did cost less, but she really was drawn to it because it showed well even in poor lighting situations. And if you stop and think about indoor exhibitions in the 1930s in particular, many museums were not well lit.
In 1951, Anna installed her monumental aluminum sculpture, Fighting Stallions, at Brookgreen's front gate, where it has become the signature image of the gardens.